Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly chilling journey back to the very heart of medieval Europe, a period often romanticized for its knights and castles, but which was, for the vast majority of its population, a relentless struggle against the unforgiving forces of nature and unseen biological threats. We're pulling back the rough linen curtain to uncover what it was like to be a peasant during the Black Death. Forget romanticized notions of chivalry or the simple struggles of daily life. You're about to discover a grim reality where death lurked in every shadow. Disease swept through communities with terrifying speed, and the fabric of society itself began to unravel under the most devastating plague in human history. This wasn't a temporary inconvenience or a local epidemic. It was an apocalyptic event that transformed landscapes, shattered families, and reordered the very nature of existence. Frankly, you probably wouldn't survive the initial whispers of its arrival without longing for a swift, painless disappearance, let alone the entire agonizing ordeal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly standing in a small, humble peasant village somewhere in England or France. In the year 47 CE, the air is thick with the familiar smells of wood smoke, damp earth, and the distant tang of animal waste. Life, though hard, has its familiar rhythms: the endless toil in the fields, the communal gatherings in the village square, the solemn rituals in the church, your family, your elderly parents, your wife, your young children, huddled together in your small cottage, their lives inextricably linked to the land and each other. Your greatest dread is usually famine or the lords demanding taxes. But then, rumors, chilling and unsettling, begin to spread, carried by traveling merchants, returning soldiers, or desperate refugees from distant lands. This is the Whispers Arrive, the early terrifying rumors of the Black Death spreading across Europe, long before it reached your tranquil, unsuspecting village. The first whispers would likely arrive subtly, almost unnoticed at first, tales of a strange, virulent disease sweeping through distant lands to the east, across Asia, through the Silk Road, as we explored in The Horrifying Dangers of Being a Merchant on the Silk Road, Chapter 4, where the plague first began its devastating journey. Then, the rumors would come closer, ships arriving in Mediterranean ports like Messina in Sicily or Genoa in Italy, carrying not just exotic goods, but also dying sailors covered in grotesque swellings. The disease, they say, is incredibly swift and utterly merciless, claiming lives by the hundreds, then thousands. It truly sucked to get your news from dying sailors. Initially, these whispers would be dismissed as exaggerated travelers' tales, distant horrors that could never reach your quiet, isolated village. But as days bled into weeks and weeks into months, the whispers would grow louder, more insistent, and terrifyingly closer. You would hear reports of entire towns decimated, of once bustling cities falling silent, of mass graves overflowing. The trade routes, which normally brought news and goods, would dry up as fear paralyzed commerce. People would talk of a divine punishment, a miasma, bad air, or a curse, as explored in previous episodes. The disturbing world of curses and black magic in ancient Rome. Chapter 1. Struggling to comprehend an unseen enemy of such devastating power, the reality was far more chilling than any rumor. The Black Death was primarily caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on black rats. These rats, hardy and ubiquitous, traveled alongside humans, hitching rides on merchant ships and wagons, effectively turning trade routes into superhighways for disease. The plague had already devastated parts of Asia and the Middle East for years before it reached Europe's shores, brought across the Mediterranean by infected ships. Your initial isolation, which normally protected your village from the outside world, was now a temporary reprieve before the inevitable. The insidious nature of its spread was horrifying. You couldn't see it. You couldn't fight it with a sword. It moved invisibly, carried by unseen vectors, until suddenly it was in your midst, a seemingly healthy visitor, a stray rat, or even the clothing of someone who had traveled from an infected town could unknowingly bring the deadly bacteria into your community. The grim reality was that the very networks that connected medieval Europe, its trade, its pilgrimages, its migrations became the pathways for its destruction. As the months passed and the plague continued its relentless march across the continent from Italy to France, to Spain, and eventually to England in 1348, the signs would become undeniable. Refugees from larger towns, gaunt and terrified, might appear on the outskirts of your village, bringing not just warnings, but often the disease itself. Families would begin to hear directly from kin in nearby communities about loved ones succumbing to the strange, swift illness. The fear, once abstract, would become personal and visceral. The psychological impact of these escalating rumors would be immense. A pervasive dread would settle over your village. People would become anxious, suspicious, watching each other for the first signs of illness. Every cough, every fever, every ache would trigger profound terror. As you knew, these were the terrifying harbingers of the plague. The daily rhythms of life would be disrupted by this mounting anxiety. Work in the fields might slow, communal gatherings might become less frequent, and a chilling silence would begin to creep into conversations. Punctuated by worried whispers, you would find yourself constantly praying, seeking solace from the church, but even the priests would be gripped by fear. Their sermons increasingly focused on divine judgment. It truly sucked to be perpetually waiting for death. The lack of accurate information and widespread misinformation further amplified the terror. People attributed the plague to various causes: divine punishment for sins, astrological alignments, poisonous miasmas, bad air emanating from swamps or earthquakes, or even conspiracies, blaming Jews, leading to tragic persecutions. This confusion meant that all efforts to prevent its spread or find a cure were utterly futile. Based on false premises, you were fighting an invisible enemy you couldn't understand, relying on theories that offered no real protection. One common misconception is that the Black Death struck everywhere simultaneously. In reality, it spread in waves, often following trade routes, affecting some regions more severely or earlier than others. Its initial arrival in Europe was in the Mediterranean ports in 1347, then it spread northward and westward. Reaching England in 1348, the slower, geographically uneven spread meant that communities often had prior warning, but this warning rarely translated into effective prevention, as their understanding of contagion was primitive. The advance of the plague was like a grim, unstoppable tide, slowly engulfing the continent. Historians still meticulously study medieval chronicles like those of Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, which describes the plague in Florence, or the Chronicon of Jean de Venette in France. Shipping records, and later bioarchaeological evidence like DNA analysis of Yersinia pestis from mass graves to reconstruct the precise routes, speed of spread, and patterns of the Black Death across Europe, confirming its horrifying trajectory. Furthermore, the very social structures of medieval Europe, particularly the feudal system and the manorial system where peasants were tied to the land, paradoxically put you at greater risk once the plague arrived. Your inability to simply abandon your land and flee without risking severe punishment from your lord meant you were often trapped in your village, forced to await the plague's arrival and its horrifying consequences. Even if you saw its grim approach, this lack of personal autonomy, even in the face of existential threat, underscored the brutal realities of your peasant life, the sight of increasingly empty roads and silent towns, as you heard reports from passing travelers or refugees, would become a chilling premonition. The familiar flow of goods and people would cease, replaced by a terrifying void that hinted at the devastation already wrought in unseen places. This sense of creeping isolation, as the world around you seemed to fall silent, added another layer of dread to your anxious waiting. The fear of death, while common in the Middle Ages, would be profoundly amplified by the plague. This was not a quick, glorious death in battle, or a slow wasting from old age. This was a swift, agonizing, and often grotesque demise, striking down the young and old, rich and poor, seemingly at random. This terrifying unpredictability instilled a profound sense of helplessness and existential dread, turning every day into a battle against both fear and the mounting evidence of the plague's unstoppable advance. So, your experience as a peasant during the Black Death began with the terrifying whispers of its distant, unseen threat, as rumors spread across Europe, detailing the horrifying speed and merciless nature of the plague. Your village braced itself for the inevitable, this period of mounting anxiety, fueled by misinformation and the chilling knowledge of the plague's relentless approach, was the first, and perhaps most profound, aspect of what it was like to be a peasant during the Black Death, ensuring your world was consumed by dread long before the sickness ever reached your doorstep. Having witnessed the terrifying whispers of hunger turn into a grim reality, your life as a medieval peasant was then plunged into the agonizing heart of famine, the hunger gap. Forget fleeting discomforts. This was a relentless period of slow starvation, where your old provisions dwindled to nothing, and the new crop stubbornly refused to ripen, pushing your family to the absolute brink of endurance. This insidious, drawn-out process of deprivation made surviving a famine profoundly terrible. Imagine your situation as winter grudgingly gives way to a cold, damp spring. The last vestiges of your autumn harvest, meticulously rationed, are now all but gone. Your family's small granary is empty, its once comforting scent of stored grain replaced by the musty smell of dust and despair. The few remaining preserved vegetables, perhaps some dried cabbage or turnips, are shriveled and unappetizing. The salted meat, if you were ever fortunate enough to have any, is a distant memory. This is the hunger gap, the most dreaded period for medieval peasants, stretching from late spring into early summer, when the previous year's food supplies run out and the new crops aren't yet ready for harvest. Imagine the chilling, empty feeling in your stomach, a gnawing absence that dominates your every thought. It truly sucked to watch your pantry literally become empty. Your body, already weakened by months of meager rations and the pervasive cold of winter, would begin to protest loudly. The dull ache of hunger would intensify into a constant, gnawing torment, a pervasive emptiness that consumed your every thought. Your stomach would perpetually rumble and cramp. Your head would throb with a persistent, dull ache, and your limbs would feel heavy, sluggish, and perpetually tired. You would experience extreme fatigue, your body struggling to perform even basic tasks like walking to the well or tending a small garden. Sleep would be restless, plagued by hunger pangs and nightmares of food, offering little true respite from the physical misery. As the famine deepened, your physical appearance would visibly deteriorate. Your cheeks would become hollow, your eyes sunken and dull, and your skin sallow and dry, stretched taut over your bones. Your muscles, deprived of essential protein and calories, would begin to waste away, leaving you gaunt and emaciated. Children, particularly vulnerable due to their rapid growth and lower energy reserves, would suffer severely, their growth stunted, their tiny bodies barely able to resist the cold or any passing illness. The elderly, already frail, would weaken rapidly, their bodies succumbing to the lack of sustenance, becoming the first, quiet casualties of the escalating crisis. You would witness your loved ones slowly wither before your very eyes, helpless to provide them with the nourishment they so desperately needed, the memory of their suffering forever etched in your mind. It truly sucked to watch your family slowly starve. The psychological toll of this slow starvation would be immense. Your mind, consumed by the primal urge for food, would struggle to focus on anything else. Conversations would revolve almost entirely around food, where to find it, how to stretch it. The memory of past meals, the agony of present hunger, hope, a fragile commodity, would slowly be replaced by despair as each day brought renewed hunger and no relief. The thought of the meager grain that remained in your possession, if any, would fill you with a terrifying mix of protectiveness and desperate longing. This pervasive obsession with food, this constant mental anguish, would erode your spirit, leaving you a desperate, hollowed-out shell, functioning on sheer instinct. The lack of medical understanding exacerbated the horrors of the hunger gap. Medieval people had no concept of balanced nutrition or vitamin deficiencies. They wouldn't understand that the weakness, the bleeding gums, or the swelling limbs were symptoms of specific conditions like scurvy, pellagra, or beriberi. Instead, they would attribute these debilitating conditions to divine displeasure, bad humors, or a general wasting sickness. There were no effective treatments for malnutrition itself, only rudimentary herbal remedies for symptoms, which offered little true relief. Your body was slowly dying, and you had no idea how to stop it, nor did any local healers. It truly sucked to literally rot from the inside out with no explanation. Compounding the misery was the unyielding grip of the feudal system and the state. Your lord, to whom you owed taxes often paid in grain, would still demand his dues, even if your harvest had utterly failed. While some merciful lords might offer limited relief or temporarily suspend taxes to prevent their peasant workforce from dying out entirely and thus losing future labor. This relief was often insufficient and came at a price. Further deepening your long-term vulnerability, local officials, driven by imperial quotas or their own greed, would relentlessly collect their share, often with brutal efficiency, leaving you and your family with even less to survive on. This relentless pressure from authority, even in the face of widespread suffering, was a constant source of injustice and despair. Ensuring that your own government was effectively starving you, it really sucked to literally pay taxes with your dwindling calories. The social dynamics within the village would also change dramatically under the pressure of famine. While communities often tried to band together in the early stages, sharing what little they had, as hunger intensified, desperate acts became more common. Petty theft, once rare and heavily punished, might become more frequent. People might begin to hoard their dwindling food supplies, distrusting their neighbors, knowing that every handout jeopardized their own family's survival. The facade of Communal solidarity could crack under the immense pressure of widespread hunger, revealing underlying resentments and individual desperation. This transformation of your once close-knit community into a place of suspicion and cutthroat survival was terrifying, leading to a profound breakdown of social order. It really sucked when your neighbors became your rivals. One common misconception is that medieval people simply died quickly during a famine, while acute starvation could lead to swift death. The hunger gap often involved a prolonged, agonizing period of chronic malnutrition and slow starvation. Exacerbated by concurrent diseases, many individuals died not just from lack of calories, but from the cascade of illnesses their weakened bodies could no longer fight off. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, which swept across northern Europe, caused millions of deaths, many of which occurred over months, demonstrating the prolonged agony of this period. This catastrophic event, marked by exceptionally cold and wet weather, transformed the landscape of northern Europe into a vast graveyard. Historians still meticulously study paleopathological evidence from medieval cemeteries, such as skeletal markers for chronic malnutrition like Harris lines on bones, indicative of growth arrest during periods of severe stress, and porous bone lesions indicating anemia, alongside climate data from tree rings and ice cores and manorial records detailing harvest yields and peasant obligations. To reconstruct the precise dietary conditions and mortality patterns during famines, consistently confirming the prevalence of prolonged, agonizing starvation and the devastating impact on human bodies. Furthermore, the lack of economic diversification in your peasant life meant you had no real alternatives. Your entire livelihood was tied to agriculture. There were no other industries, no other stable jobs to fall back on if the fields failed. You couldn't simply move to a city to find work if the fields failed, as cities themselves would be struggling with an influx of starving rural migrants and often close their gates to prevent further overcrowding and spread of disease. This absolute lack of alternatives trapped you in the grim reality of your village, forcing you to endure the hunger gap with no escape, making your fate almost entirely predetermined by the success of your harvest. The psychological impact of constant, severe hunger would be transformative. Your body would slowly shut down, conserving energy, leading to apathy and a dulled emotional response. You might become listless, unable to concentrate, your mind fixated solely on food. The physical pain would be incessant, punctuated by bouts of severe weakness. This relentless physical and mental torment would erode your spirit, leading to a profound sense of hopelessness and existential despair. You were fighting not just for food, but for your very sanity and humanity. In a battle you were slowly losing, watching your very essence wither away under the pressure of starvation. The sight of death would become commonplace. You would see the bodies of your neighbors, their faces hollow, their limbs emaciated, lying in their homes or in the streets, too weak to move or too far gone to care. The unburied dead would further contaminate the environment, attracting disease-carrying vermin and intensifying the spread of illness. This constant exposure to widespread suffering and death would desensitize you, a grim adaptation to survive an unthinkable reality. But it would leave indelible scars on your psyche, haunting your memories for the rest of your life. If you survived, the ultimate irony was that while this period was one of profound suffering, it also inadvertently led to significant social changes in the long term, particularly after the subsequent arrival of the Black Death. The mass mortality of peasants led to a labor shortage, which, over decades, eventually gave surviving peasants more bargaining power with their lords, leading to the decline of serfdom and subtle improvements in living conditions for the survivors. However, for you, enduring the hunger gap. These long-term societal shifts were utterly meaningless, offering no comfort in your immediate, agonizing struggle for survival. You were living the cost, not the benefit, of historical change. So, your experience during a medieval famine was defined by the hunger gap, a relentless period of slow starvation that pushed your family to the absolute brink of endurance. The gnawing ache in your stomach, the visible wasting of your body, and the profound psychological toll of perpetual deprivation made this insidious form of suffering a central, agonizing reality. This drawing out of your misery, transforming hunger into a protracted battle for survival, was a defining, terrible aspect of enduring a famine in the Middle Ages. Having been thrust into the agonizing heart of the hunger gap, your desperate struggle for survival in a medieval famine would inevitably lead you to a horrifying, and often risky, last resort, desperate foraging. Forget a simple trip to the supermarket. You would be forced to seek sustenance from inedible plants, tree bark, and even clay, making your continued existence a profoundly terrible act of self-preservation. Imagine the gnawing pangs of hunger that now dominated your every thought. Your family's meager food stores were utterly depleted. Your neighbors, equally desperate, had little to share. The local market, if it even still existed, would have astronomical prices for any remaining grain. Far beyond your reach, the traditional sources of food had vanished, leaving you with no choice but to turn to the land itself, searching for anything that might quell the relentless ache in your stomach. However unpalatable or dangerous, you were beyond desperation, now entering a primal battle for any scrap of sustenance. It truly sucked to forage for your next meal when there was no food left. Your desperate foraging would take you beyond the familiar cultivated fields and into the surrounding woodlands, vast meadows, and along frozen riverbanks. You would scour the landscape with relentless determination, searching for anything that resembled food, however remotely. This was not a skill passed down for everyday use. It was a desperate art learned in the crucible of famine, often through agonizing trial and error, or by grimly observing others pushed to the same brink. Your eyes, once scanning for ripe grain, now searched for withered roots or patches of moss. The types of famine foods you would resort to were chilling, truly pushing the boundaries of what a human body could consume. Wild plants and roots? You would search for wild roots, tubers, and plants that were normally considered inedible, unpalatable, or even mildly poisonous. Knowledge of safe, wild edibles, however rudimentary, would be vital, passed down through the whispers of desperate survival. However, misidentification was a constant danger. Consuming a poisonous plant could lead to severe illness, agonizing vomiting and diarrhea, further dehydrating your weakened body, or even death, ironically exacerbating your body's already weakened state. You might try boiling tough leaves or grinding fibrous roots that ordinarily would make you sick, hoping your body could somehow extract enough meager calories to survive for another day. Imagine eating bitter, stringy roots, feeling your stomach churn, but forcing it down, bite by agonizing bite, knowing it was all that stood between your family and oblivion. Tree bark, when even wild plants vanished from the over-foraged landscape, the truly desperate would resort to consuming tree bark, particularly the inner bark, the cambium layer of certain trees like elm, birch, pine, or even some willow species. This inner bark, while technically digestible in small amounts, is extremely fibrous, provides minimal nutritional value, and is incredibly difficult to process and consume. You would strip the bark from trees, perhaps try to dry it, and then attempt to grind it into a fine powder to mix with water or any remaining, precious grain to form a desperate, unappetizing gruel. Imagine chewing on tough, woody bark, feeling it scratch your throat, providing almost no energy, yet knowing it was your only option for survival. It truly sucked to eat a tree for dinner. Moss and lichen. These hardy growths could be found even in severe conditions, clinging to rocks and tree trunks, while some types are edible after extensive processing, e.g., boiling multiple times to remove bitter compounds. Many are indigestible or contain harmful compounds. You would gather them from damp, cold surfaces, trying to clean them as best you could, then boil them into a thin, unappetizing broth, hoping for any caloric intake, however minuscule. The sheer effort for so little reward was a testament to your utter desperation. Animal feed, fodder. Any feed meant for livestock, like hay, straw, or dried chaff. The husks of grains might be consumed. These fibrous materials are largely indigestible for humans and could cause severe intestinal blockages and further digestive distress. But in the throes of desperate hunger, even these options seem viable, offering a false sense of fullness. You were competing with your own starving animals for their food. Clay and earth in the most extreme and horrifying stages of famine, when all organic matter had vanished. Some desperate individuals resorted to consuming clay or earth. This practice, known as geophagy, was not for nutrition. It provides none, but to create a false sense of fullness, to quell the agonizing stomach cramps, or to absorb toxins. It was a clear, chilling sign of utter desperation, indicating that the body had completely exhausted its energy reserves and was trying to fill itself with anything at all. Imagine swallowing cold, gritty earth, feeling it sit heavily and unnaturally in your empty, aching stomach. A grim and chilling act of despair that highlighted the absolute last resort for survival. It truly sucked to eat dirt to feel full. The dangers of desperate foraging were immense, extending far beyond the risk of poisoning. You were venturing into lands that might belong to your lord, risking severe punishment, physical beatings, fines, or confiscation of any remaining meager possessions if caught trespassing or perceived as poaching. You might encounter other desperate, equally ravaged individuals or groups who would fight viciously, often violently, for a meager patch of edible weeds or a strip of bark. Your physical weakness, already exacerbated by prolonged hunger and the onset of illness, would make you incredibly vulnerable to falls, injuries, and further exposure to the elements during your arduous, solitary searches for sustenance. You were a walking target in a world where everyone was desperate. It truly sucked to fight for rotten roots. The psychological toll of resorting to such famine foods would be profound and lasting. You were consuming substances that your body instinctively rejected. That tasted awful, and that often made you sick, without providing true nourishment. This degradation of your diet, this constant battle against your own gag reflex, would be a constant reminder of your desperate situation, eroding your dignity and contributing to a profound sense of despair. You were fighting not just for physical survival, but for your very humanity, reduced to a primal struggle for any edible scrap, transforming your relationship with food into one of pure, brutal necessity. One common misconception is that all peasants in the Middle Ages had extensive knowledge of wild edibles and could always find food through foraging. In reality, while some basic knowledge of local edible plants was common, the specific famine foods resorted to during severe famines like tree bark or certain roots, mosses, were often unpalatable, nutritionally poor, and dangerous, indicating a desperate last resort rather than a sustainable strategy. Their consumption often led to further illness, digestive issues, and death. Highlighting the utter desperation of the situation, the very fact that chroniclers recorded instances of bark eating or geophagy underscores how unusual and horrifying these practices were considered. Even in a time of widespread hardship, historians still meticulously study paleobotanical evidence plant remains from archaeological sites, including remnants of famine foods in human waste deposits, when identifiable, and medieval chronicles and administrative records describing famines which sometimes mention peasants eating grass, roots, and barks, or even more horrifying things to understand the precise types of famine foods consumed and their severe nutritional and health impacts, consistently confirming their desperate and often detrimental nature, pushing human survival to its absolute limits. Furthermore, the very act of competing for these meager, undesirable resources would strain social bonds within your village if every family was desperately foraging in the same limited area. Traditional communal sharing might break down, leading to silent rivalries and bitter disputes for access to the few remaining edible plants or trees. You would be constantly aware of others' hunger and their desperate search, mirroring your own, adding another layer of anxiety and distrust to your already solitary struggle. The desperation of others was a constant, grim mirror reflecting your own descent. The sheer ineffectiveness of these famine foods for true sustenance only added to the misery. While they might provide a temporary feeling of fullness or a minuscule amount of calories, they could not halt the slow process of starvation. Your body would continue to waste away, your immune system would remain profoundly compromised, and you would still be highly susceptible to disease. The immense effort expended in foraging often yielded only marginal, fleeting benefits, pushing you closer to exhaustion and despair without truly alleviating your fundamental hunger. Your frantic efforts were a testament to your will to live, but often a futile one against the relentless march of starvation. The psychological toll of enduring this ultimate degradation, of consuming what was essentially inedible, would leave profound, indelible scars. You would forever be haunted by the memory of the taste, the texture, and the desperation of those moments. Your humanity, stretched to its breaking point, would be irrevocably altered by the choices forced upon you by extreme hunger, shaping your worldview into one of grim, primal survival. Your very existence became a living testament to the unspeakable lengths human beings would go to simply to survive. So, your experience during a medieval famine was defined by desperate foraging, forcing you to seek sustenance from inedible plants, tree bark, and even clay, in a terrifying, risky act of self-preservation. This grim reality of consuming famine foods, despite their unpalatability and potential dangers, was a defining, profoundly terrible aspect of your survival, ensuring that your continued existence was a constant battle against physical degradation, psychological torment, and the ultimate shame of consuming the unthinkable, having been thrust into the agonizing heart of the hunger gap and forced to stoop to desperate foraging. Your physical and mental strength, already pushed to its breaking point, would face a new, harrowing challenge. The relentless grip of famine could compel you and your family to make the most heartbreaking decision, abandoning the land. Forget staying to fight for your home. The brutal necessity of survival would force you to leave your ancestral village, embarking on a perilous migration in search of food and a tenuous chance at life, making this desperate act a profoundly terrible reality. Imagine the agonizing, drawn-out discussion in your dimly lit, smoke-filled cottage. For generations, Your family's life, its very identity, has been inextricably linked to this small plot of land. It is your heritage, your ancestors' resting place, the source of your existence. However meager, the thought of leaving it, even temporarily, is an unthinkable act, a profound betrayal of your lineage and your future, but your granary is empty. The last desperate roots have been dug from the frozen ground, and your children's cries of hunger grow weaker, their small bodies wasting away with each passing day. The land, once your life, has now become your prison, offering only the grim certainty of slow starvation if you remain. The choice is stark, agonizing, and yet, ultimately, there is no real choice: stay and die, or leave and gamble on a terrifying unknown. It truly sucked to have your home turn into your grave. The decision to abandon your land was rarely made lightly. It was a last resort measure, a sign of utter desperation, taken only when all other survival strategies, meticulous rationing, desperate foraging, appeals to your lord, begging from neighbors had failed, and the threat of imminent death by starvation became an undeniable, terrifying reality. It represented a complete rupture with your past, a severance of the deepest ties that bound you to your community, your ancestral spirits, and your heritage, your family. Perhaps clutching a few meager, easily transportable possessions, a worn blanket, a small cooking pot, a family amulet would be setting out into a vast, unfamiliar, and hostile world with no guarantee of finding food, shelter, or acceptance. You were becoming a refugee in your own land, your life reduced to a desperate, uncertain journey. Your destination, if you had one, would likely be a city, urban centers, even in times of famine, often held a desperate, illusory allure. The belief was that cities, with their larger populations, their more complex economies, and their concentration of wealth, might still have food. Perhaps it would be found in the lord's granaries, or in the hands of wealthy merchants who hoarded supplies, or through the charity offered by monasteries, churches, or wealthy citizens. You might hope for casual labor in the markets or on docks to earn a few coins for a scrap of bread. The city, once a distant, bustling place of wonders, now represented a faint, desperate glimmer of hope. However dangerous or unlikely, it truly sucked to trade rural starvation for urban squalor. The journey itself would be incredibly perilous, a continuation of the famine's horrors, often leading to more suffering than the village you left behind. You would travel entirely on foot, your family already severely weakened by prolonged starvation, your children barely able to walk, their small bodies racked by hunger pangs. Roads would be clogged with other desperate migrants, equally gaunt, hollow-eyed, and hopeless, turning the paths into grim, unending processions of human misery, stretching for miles in a tragic parade of despair. You would face a multitude of dangers, further starvation and thirst. Your meager provisions, if you had any, would quickly run out. Consumed within the first few days, you would then rely on desperate foraging along the roadside, in fields that had likely already been picked clean by previous waves of migrants, or resort to begging from unsympathetic travelers. Water sources would be scarce, often stagnant or contaminated by the thousands of desperate people congregating along the routes. This would lead to rampant outbreaks of dysentery and other waterborne diseases, which would rapidly claim lives along the route. Your body, already ravaged by hunger, would be even more vulnerable to these swift, dehydrating killers. Imagine your throat parched, your stomach in knots, knowing every sip of murky water might carry agony or death. Disease contagion would spread like wildfire among the marching columns of starving, weakened people. Typhoid fever, smallpox, various fevers from typhus, often spread by lice thriving in unsanitary, crowded conditions, and other infectious diseases would sweep through the moving masses, claiming lives indiscriminately. You would witness children and the elderly collapsing, their bodies too weak to continue, often simply left by the roadside to perish, as their families simply lacked the strength or resources to carry them further. The very act of seeking salvation would expose you to greater peril. The roads became lines of graves, banditry, and exploitation. Desperate times bred desperate people, and the roads were rife with human predators. You would face the constant threat of bandits preying on vulnerable migrants, robbing them of their last few possessions, or even kidnapping women and children for sale into slavery in distant markets. Corrupt local officials or opportunistic landowners might exploit your desperation, demanding exorbitant fees for passage through their lands, or offering deceptive promises of work that would lead to further exploitation and debt bondage. Your vulnerability would be immense. You were literally walking wealth for those without scruples, with no protection from the law. Environmental hazards, depending on the region and the season. You might face harsh weather conditions, scorching summer heat leading to heat stroke, or sudden cold snaps and freezing temperatures in winter leading to hypothermia and frostbite. Treacherous terrain, like mountains or marshes, combined with your physical weakness, would increase the risk of falls and severe injuries. Far from any help, your inadequate clothing and physical weakness would offer little protection against nature's fury, making every natural obstacle a potential death trap. Upon reaching a city, your initial surge of hope might quickly turn to profound despair. Cities, while initially attracting migrants, would swiftly become overcrowded death traps themselves. The influx of thousands of starving peasants would utterly overwhelm the city's limited resources and rudimentary sanitation infrastructure. Food, if available at all, would be exorbitantly expensive, far beyond your reach. Competition for meager casual labor would be fierce, turning your desperation into a futile struggle against equally desperate urban poor. You might find yourself living in squalid, unsanitary slums, sharing cramped, unheated spaces with thousands of others, creating ideal conditions for diseases to spread rapidly. The city, once a beacon of hope, would transform into a nightmarish labyrinth, its streets filled with suffering, begging, and death, mirroring the very misery you had tried to escape. It truly sucked to find that your refuge was another prison. The psychological toll of abandoning your land and embarking on such a desperate migration would be immense and lasting. You would carry the crushing guilt of leaving your ancestral home, the profound agony of seeing your family suffer and die on the road, and the terrifying uncertainty of your future, the constant fear of starvation, disease, and violence, coupled with the dehumanizing humiliation of begging or resorting to desperate acts like crime, would erode your spirit. You would be a refugee in your own land, your identity as a proud peasant stripped away, consumed by the sheer, brutal struggle for survival. This was a profound and irreversible trauma, leaving indelible scars on your psyche. It really sucked to lose your dignity just to stay alive. One common misconception is that medieval peasants were entirely passive in the face of famine. While they certainly endured immense suffering, historical records show various active, albeit desperate, coping mechanisms, including desperate foraging as seen in Chapter 3, selling off possessions, as we'll discuss in Chapter 8, and when all else failed. Migration to cities or other regions? This mobility, however, was rarely successful in finding true long-term relief and often led to further hardship and death. As cities themselves struggled to cope with the influx of starving migrants, often closing their gates or establishing strict controls to prevent further overcrowding and spread of disease. The very act of abandoning the land was a desperate gamble, often with devastating consequences regardless of the initial decision. Historians still meticulously study medieval demographic records, urban growth patterns during famines, and local chronicles detailing rural depopulation and urban overcrowding to understand the precise migratory patterns and their devastating impact on both rural and urban communities during periods of severe food crisis. This research often reveals mass movements of desperate people, creating profound social disruption. Furthermore, the act of leaving your dead behind on the road would be a particularly agonizing horror. Your family members who succumbed to hunger, disease, or exhaustion during the march might be buried hastily by the roadside, in shallow, unmarked graves, or simply left where they fell. As you lack the strength or the time to give them a proper burial, this profound desecration. The inability to honor your loved ones with proper funerary rites, which were deeply important in medieval society, would be a lasting source of grief and spiritual torment. Adding to the psychological scars of your desperate journey, their memory would forever haunt you, a constant reminder of the price of your survival. The very concept of your property and social standing would be completely lost. Your land, your tools, your meager possessions, all would be abandoned. Claimed by your lord if you were a serf tied to the land, by opportunistic neighbors, or simply left to ruin, you would arrive at your destination as a destitute pauper, stripped of all assets, reduced to begging or performing the most menial labor, your former identity utterly erased by the relentless march of famine. Your entire life's work, your ancestral heritage, vanished in a desperate flight for survival. The ultimate irony was that while abandoning the land offered a desperate, final hope for survival, it often merely traded one form of misery for another, often more concentrated and lethal. The city, initially a beacon of salvation, quickly became a new kind of prison, its streets filled with desperate, starving faces, mirroring the very suffering you had tried to escape, and amplifying its horrors through overcrowding and rampant disease. Your choice to leave was a testament to your profound desperation, but rarely a pathway to true salvation. So, your experience during a medieval famine meant confronting the agonizing decision to abandon the land. This desperate act plunged you into a perilous migration, plagued by relentless starvation, rampant disease, vicious banditry, and the constant threat of death. This brutal journey, severing all ties to your home and heritage, and often leading to an equally grim fate in overcrowded, disease-ridden cities, was a defining, profoundly terrible aspect of how you would survive a famine in the Middle Ages. Having abandoned your ancestral land and embarked on a desperate migration, your hope for survival often led you to the brutal streets of a medieval city, where seeking charity became your daily, humiliating reality. Forget dignified appeals. You would resort to begging, petty crime, and profound despair, making your survival profoundly terrible. Imagine your arrival at the city gates. You, once a proud peasant with a home and a farm, now stand as a gaunt, ragged migrant, one of thousands who have fled the famine-stricken countryside. The city, perhaps London, Paris, or Florence, though larger and seemingly more prosperous than your village, is utterly overwhelmed by the relentless influx of starving refugees. The very air is thick with the cries of beggars, the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies, and the palpable desperation of masses crammed into squalid slums. Your initial. Desperate hope quickly gives way to a chilling realization the city is not a haven, not a sanctuary, but a larger, more brutal battleground for survival. Where competition for the barest sustenance is fierce, it truly sucked to find that the city was no paradise, but just a bigger, dirtier prison. Your immediate reality became begging. You would spend your days and often nights in public spaces outside churches, near bustling markets, by the gates of monasteries or noble houses extending your emaciated hand, pleading in a hoarse voice for a scrap of bread, a handful of coins, or any leftover food. The humiliation would be immense. You, who once toiled with dignity in the fields, were now reduced to supplicating strangers for mere sustenance. You would face indifference, scorn, and outright hostility from citizens who feared contagion, or resented the overwhelming influx of the poor, or simply found your suffering inconvenient. Imagine the hollow feeling in your stomach, not just from hunger, but from the constant degradation of your spirit, your voice hoarse from endless pleas, your eyes desperate. It really sucked to literally beg for your life, day after day, year after year. The competition for charity was fierce and often brutal. Thousands of others, equally desperate, equally gaunt, would be vying for the same limited handouts. This created a profound, unspoken competition among the starving, turning fellow sufferers into immediate rivals for survival. You might find yourself shoved aside, ignored, or even physically attacked by those more desperate, more aggressive, or simply stronger. The meager alms offered by merciful citizens or religious institutions like monasteries, which ran soup kitchens, were never enough to sustain everyone, forcing you into constant, desperate competition for every crumb, every copper coin. This struggle against your own kind for survival was a profound and constant source of anxiety. When begging proved insufficient to quiet the gnawing pangs of hunger, desperation could drive you to petty crime. The strict laws of medieval cities, which often applied draconian punishments for even minor offenses, as explored in The Brutal Punishments You Faced for Minor Crimes in Egypt. Chapter 1, whose principles extended to medieval Europe, meant even minor theft could lead to brutal consequences. But hunger, a more primal force than any law, would compel you. You might steal a loaf of bread from a baker's stall, snatch a discarded apple from a cart, or try to pilfer a few coins from an unwary passerby. Every act of theft was a terrifying gamble, risking public flogging, mutilation, loss of a hand for repeated theft, or even execution if caught. Imagine the pounding of your heart, the racing adrenaline, as you risk your life for a single bite of food. Your moral compass completely overridden by starvation. It really sucked to gamble your life on a stolen apple. The dangers of urban life during famine were immense and multifaceted. Disease overcrowding in unsanitary slums, contaminated water sources, and widespread malnutrition turned cities into massive breeding grounds for epidemics. Typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, and various fevers from typhus, often spread by lice thriving in such conditions, would sweep through the impoverished population, claiming lives indiscriminately and rapidly. You would live in constant fear of contagion, knowing that one cough from a stranger, one sip of contaminated water, or one bite from an infected rat could mean an agonizing death. Imagine suffering from a raging fever in a crowded, filthy slum, with no one able or willing to care for you. Your only companions, the groans of other dying souls. Violence, desperation bred violence, robbery, assault, and even murder would become more common as people fought for dwindling resources. You, a weakened, gaunt migrant, would be particularly vulnerable to exploitation or attack by opportunistic criminals. Street gangs, or even callous citizens who preyed on the helpless, your meager possessions, or even just your body, could become a target. Lack of shelter. If you couldn't afford lodging, which was almost certainly the case for a starving peasant migrant, you would sleep in alleys, under market stalls, in abandoned buildings, or beneath bridges, exposed to the elements, to the biting cold of winter nights, and to the constant threat of being harassed, robbed, or attacked by others more desperate or cruel. Exposure to elements, even in the relative shelter of a city, sleeping outdoors or in unheated hovels, meant constant exposure to rain, cold, and dampness, exacerbating your already weakened state and leading to further illness like pneumonia or severe respiratory infections. The humiliation of your fall from grace would be profound and constant. You, who once had a home, a farm, a community, were now a homeless beggar, an outcast in a society that often viewed poverty as a moral failing or a sign of divine displeasure. Your dignity would be stripped away, replaced by the shame of your circumstances. You would constantly be aware of the disdain in the eyes of wealthier citizens, the whispered condemnations, and the general revulsion your presence inspired. The psychological burden, this profound degradation, was often as debilitating as the hunger itself, leading to profound despair and the erosion of your self-worth. It really sucked to lose your dignity in the streets. Day by day, the church and monastic orders would often be the primary source of organized charity during famines, operating soup kitchens or offering meager handouts of gruel or stale bread to the starving masses. However, their resources, while substantial, were almost always overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the famine. They could provide only temporary relief, a drop in the ocean of widespread suffering, forcing you back to the streets and the agonizing, daily struggle for sustenance. Your hope, if it existed at all, would be tenuous, tied to the limited compassion and overstretched resources of institutions already pushed to their breaking point. One common misconception is that medieval cities, with their larger populations and centers of power, were always a haven from rural famines. In reality, while they initially attracted starving migrants with the promise of food, they quickly became overwhelmed, transforming into even more dangerous environments due to extreme overcrowding, rapid disease transmission, and intense competition for limited resources. The influx of desperate rural poor often led to a breakdown of urban social order and a proliferation of crime, making cities a grim final destination for many who fled the countryside. Historians still meticulously study medieval urban demographic records. Poor relief provisions, often detailed in municipal or monastic accounts, and city ordinances which frequently tried to regulate or expel beggars, highlighting the perceived social problem of mass migration during famines to understand the precise impact of famines on urban populations, consistently confirming the dire conditions and astronomically high mortality rates in overcrowded cities during such crises. Furthermore, the very act of consuming contaminated food or water in the city, whether obtained through begging, scavenging, or desperate purchases, would lead to chronic illness. You might constantly battle dysentery or other gastrointestinal ailments, further weakening your already emaciated body and making it even harder to seek food or shelter. Your attempt to survive only accelerated your physical decay, trapping you in a vicious cycle of hunger and sickness that was almost impossible to escape. The psychological toll of living in perpetual desperation, constantly battling hunger, fear, and humiliation would be immense and lasting. You would live with a profound sense of hopelessness, your spirit slowly eroding, replaced by apathy and a dulled emotional response. The constant struggle for survival would consume your every thought, leaving little room for anything else. The loss of your home, your family's dignity, and your very identity would be a permanent scar, making your continued existence a form of living torment. Far from any real salvation, you would be a ghost among the living, forever marked by the horrors of famine, your humanity stripped bare by relentless deprivation. The final irony was that while abandoning the land offered a desperate hope for survival, it often merely traded one form of misery for another, often more concentrated and lethal. The city, initially a beacon, quickly became a new kind of prison, its streets filled with desperate, starving faces, mirroring the very suffering you had tried to escape, and amplifying its horrors through overcrowding, rampant disease, and constant danger. Your choice to leave was a testament to your profound desperation, but rarely a pathway to true salvation. So, your experience during a medieval famine, having abandoned your land, plunged you into the brutal reality of seeking charity. This led to a daily, humiliating existence of begging, desperate petty crime, and constant exposure to the dangers of overcrowded, disease-ridden cities. This profound physical and psychological degradation, ensuring your survival, came at the cost of your dignity and despair, was a defining, profoundly terrible aspect of how you would survive a famine in the Middle Ages. Having abandoned your ancestral land and sought desperate refuge in the city, your survival during a medieval famine was truly plunged into its chilling heart, the city itself, transformed into an overcrowded death trap. Forget urban hope, the relentless influx of starving migrants, coupled with catastrophic sanitation failures and rampant disease, turned once bustling centers into cauldrons of contagion and despair, making your continued existence profoundly terrible. Imagine the horrifying reality that now defined your every waking moment. You arrived at the city gates, clinging to a desperate, fading hope for relief. But what you found was not a haven, but a swirling vortex of human misery. Medieval cities, despite their charm and economic vitality, were simply not equipped to handle the massive, unprecedented influx of starving refugees from the countryside during a major famine. Their limited infrastructure, designed for a stable population, was utterly overwhelmed, collapsing under the immense strain. This meant extreme overcrowding. A human sardine canned thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of gaunt, desperate peasants poured into urban centers. They crammed into already dense slums, squatted in abandoned buildings, or simply slept in the streets, alleyways, and even churchyards. This created incredibly tight living quarters, turning every corner into a densely packed, suffocating mass of humanity. Imagine trying to find a place to lay your head, literally shoulder to shoulder with dozens of other desperate, unwashed, and already sick bodies, breathing the same stale, fetid air. This extreme proximity, a constant physical assault, ensured that any pathogen introduced would spread like wildfire through the weakened population. It truly sucked to be packed like sardines in a dying city. Catastrophic sanitation collapse. Drowning in filth, medieval cities already struggled with basic sanitation. Most lacked modern plumbing, sewage systems, or organized waste disposal services. The sudden, massive increase in population utterly overwhelmed any rudimentary existing systems. Human and animal waste accumulated rapidly and openly in streets, public squares, open drains, and communal spaces, mixing with rotting food scraps and general refuse. There were no proper latrines for the new arrivals, turning entire districts into open sewers. This rampant filth created an ideal breeding ground for every conceivable disease, flies swarming over waste, rats proliferating in abundance, and a pervasive, stomach-churning stench that hung perpetually in the air. Imagine trying to walk through streets where every step risked contact with human excrement, the overpowering odor clinging to your clothes and person. It truly sucked to literally drown in filth. Contaminated water sources, a sip of death, city wells, rivers, and water conduits, often already susceptible to pollution from urban waste, became severely and lethally contaminated by the overwhelming accumulation of waste and the sheer volume of desperate people drawing from them. Drinking this water was an almost guaranteed path to severe waterborne illnesses, dysentery often called the bloody flux, causing relentless, bloody diarrhea, agonizing abdominal cramps, and rapid dehydration, became rampant typhoid fever, a systemic bacterial infection causing high fevers, headaches, and severe gastrointestinal distress, also swept through the population. Imagine being parched, desperately needing water, knowing that every sip might bring agonizing cramps, endless purging, or a rapid, agonizing death. It truly sucked to be thirsty, but fear the water. Disease spreads like wildfire. The invisible killer. This complete breakdown of sanitation, combined with extreme overcrowding and the widespread malnutrition of the famine migrants whose immune systems were already severely compromised, created perfect conditions for disease to spread like wildfire. Cities, once perceived as beacons of civilization, rapidly transformed into cauldrons of contagion, becoming death traps far more lethal than the countryside. Various fevers from typhus, often spread by lice and fleas, thriving in such unsanitary, crowded conditions, smallpox, and other infectious diseases would sweep through the impoverished population, claiming lives indiscriminately and rapidly. The mortality rate in these overcrowded cities would skyrocket, often claiming far more lives than in the rural areas, and certainly more than any battle or natural disaster. You would witness death everywhere in the streets, in the gutters, in abandoned buildings. Bodies, often emaciated by famine and then ravaged by plague, would lie unburied for days, further contaminating the environment and accelerating the spread of the very diseases that claim them. The constant sight of death, the pervasive sounds of suffering, and the smell of decaying flesh would become a sickening, normalized part of your daily reality. It truly sucked to watch your chosen refuge become your tomb. Breakdown of social order, survival of the ruthless. The extreme desperation in these urban environments led to a profound breakdown of social order. Competition for meager food scraps and casual labor would intensify, turning even formerly compassionate individuals into ruthless rivals. Petty crime, once rare and heavily punished, would flourish. The desperation could drive people to violence, turning the teeming slums into brutal battlegrounds for mere survival. You would witness widespread acts of selfishness, cruelty, and despair. As the veneer of civility dissolved under the relentless pressure of mass starvation and disease, people would fight over a crust of bread, betray neighbors for a warm spot, or abandon their dying kin to save themselves. Your humanity itself would be tested, as you struggled to maintain your own moral compass amidst unimaginable suffering, forced to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. It truly sucked to see humanity stripped bare. Primitive healthcare. No hope? Only suffering. The lack of medical care was almost absolute. City physicians, if any, would be overwhelmed or would flee. Hospitals, often run by monastic orders, would quickly fill beyond capacity. Their rudimentary treatments utterly ineffective against widespread epidemics. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, no sterile environments for treatment. If you fell severely ill, your survival depended entirely on your body's own brute resilience and immense, improbable luck. Many resorted to desperate folk remedies, sometimes harmful, in a futile attempt to cling to life, only prolonging their agony. Your suffering would be private, painful, and largely unalleviated. It truly sucked to be sick with no one to cure you. The psychology of urban hell. Despair and numbness. The psychological toll of living in such an urban hellscape, constantly surrounded by death and despair, would be immense. The loss of dignity, the constant fear of contagion, and the pervasive sight of unimaginable suffering would erode your spirit. Hope, already fragile from your journey, would often be utterly extinguished, replaced by a profound sense of futility and a chilling numbness to the horrors around you. Your existence became a prolonged, agonizing waiting game for your own inevitable demise. Your identity as a survivor consumed by the sheer scale of the surrounding death. A constant reminder that you were merely a statistic in a city dying around you. This profound despair would be a far worse killer than any disease. It truly sucked to lose your will to live. Historical reality. A common grave. One common misconception is that medieval cities, with their larger populations, were always better equipped to handle crises than rural areas. While they had more resources in absolute terms, their lack of modern sanitation and their fixed infrastructure meant they were disproportionately vulnerable to the kind of population influx and rapid disease transmission seen during famines. The very density that made them economic hubs also made them ideal breeding grounds for epidemics when conditions deteriorated. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, which primarily struck northern Europe, leading to widespread starvation, saw urban centers across northern Europe become particularly lethal, with death tolls far exceeding those in the countryside, as starving rural migrants brought diseases to already stressed urban environments. This historical fact, the transformation of cities into massive graveyards, is well documented. Historians still meticulously study medieval urban demographic records. Poor relief provisions often detailed in municipal or monastic accounts, and city ordinances which frequently tried to regulate or expel beggars, highlighting the perceived social problem of mass migration during famines to understand the precise impact of famines on urban populations, consistently confirming the dire conditions and astronomically high mortality rates in overcrowded cities during such crises. The urban environment, paradoxically, became a more efficient killer. The unburied dead public horrors, the sheer scale of death meant that bodies, often emaciated by famine and then ravaged by disease, would lie unburied for days or even weeks in streets, alleyways, and abandoned buildings. This was not just a grim sight. It further contaminated the environment, accelerating the spread of the very diseases that claimed them. The constant presence of corpses, the pervasive stench of decay, and the knowledge that your own body might soon join them was a sickening, normalized part of your daily reality. This public display of death, stripping away all dignity, was a final, horrifying indignity in your struggle for survival. So, your attempt to survive a medieval famine, having abandoned your land, plunged you into a horrifying reality where the city itself became an overcrowded death trap. The influx of starving migrants, coupled with catastrophic sanitation collapse, contaminated water, and rampant disease transformed urban centers into cauldrons of contagion and despair. This pervasive squalor, ensuring your daily life was a battle against unseen killers and overwhelming human misery, was a defining, profoundly terrible aspect of how you would survive a famine in the Middle Ages. Even as your emaciated body fought against the squalor of overcrowded cities, your desperate attempt to survive a medieval famine was relentlessly stalked by its most terrifying companion, the plague's shadow. Forget isolated illness. Widespread disease outbreaks, particularly the Black Death, were exacerbated by widespread starvation, turning your existence into a profound and terrible battle against unseen, merciless killers. Imagine the pervasive cold that would settle in your stomach, a chilling dread that transcended mere hunger. Famine, while devastating on its own, rarely traveled alone. It was almost always accompanied by epidemic disease, a horrifying partnership that ensured mass mortality. Your body, already severely weakened by months of chronic malnutrition, as discussed in Chapter 2, from a meager, monotonous diet, had a severely compromised immune system. Your body's defenses were utterly depleted, leaving you a prime target for every pathogen circulating in the unsanitary. Overcrowded conditions of your village or the city slums, this biological vulnerability, born of starvation, meant your body simply couldn't fight back effectively. It truly sucked to be starving and then get sick. The medieval period was particularly vulnerable to devastating pandemics, and the Black Death CC 1347-1351 CE serves as the most horrifying example, while the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which likely started with agricultural and climate issues, leading to starvation, predated the Black Death by a few decades. Famines often created the perfect conditions for later outbreaks, or for other deadly diseases to thrive simultaneously. A population weakened by starvation, living in unsanitary conditions, was a fertile ground for plague. The close quarters of the city, now overflowing with desperate migrants, were an ideal incubator for rapid disease transmission, turning your temporary refuge into a death trap. Imagine the onset of the plague within your famine-stricken community. It would strike swiftly and brutally, often without warning. You would observe the terrifying symptoms: sudden, raging fever and chills. Your body would convulse with uncontrollable shivers, followed by an agonizing, burning fever that consumed you from within. Agonizing buboes, bubo swollen, tender, and incredibly painful blackish lumps would erupt in your armpits, groin, or neck, sometimes growing to the size of an apple. These would be excruciatingly tender, and often burst, oozing pus and blood. A grotesque and visible sign of the disease consuming you. Imagine the visible horror, the profound pain, a clear sign of the disease consuming you. Blackening skin. As the disease progressed, your skin might develop black spots due to subcutaneous hemorrhages, a terrifying sign of internal bleeding, giving the Black Death its chilling name: vomiting, diarrhea, and delirium. Your body would be racked by severe gastrointestinal distress, extreme dehydration, and a profound mental confusion, often leading to agonizing, undignified death. Your final moments spent in a state of terror and physical breakdown. The speed of death was terrifying. Many victims, especially those already emaciated by famine, succumbed within days, sometimes even hours, of the first symptoms appearing. There was no time for traditional remedies, no time for farewells, no time for proper burial. People would go to bed seemingly healthy and be dead by morning. This rapid, indiscriminate mortality, coupled with the existing famine deaths, left communities utterly reeling, unable to cope with the sheer volume of the dead. The sheer number of corpses, often lying unburied in the streets, would become a horrifying reality. Further spreading disease and terror, it truly sucked to watch everyone die around you. The lack of effective medical care for plague was almost absolute. Medieval physicians, guided by rudimentary medical theories like humoral theory, believing in imbalances of bodily fluids, or miasma theory, believing in bad air, had no understanding of the bacterial cause, Yersinia pestis, or its transmission primarily via fleas on rats. Their cures bloodletting, which would further weaken your already depleted body. Purging causing more dehydration. Crude herbal poultices, or burning aromatic herbs, were utterly ineffective and often harmful, accelerating death rather than alleviating suffering. Doctors themselves, trying to aid the sick, were often among the first to die, leaving communities utterly helpless, with no one to turn to for even a semblance of hope. Imagine your local healer trying to save you with a futile potion, then dying himself. It really sucked to be a patient in medieval times. The breakdown of society during such outbreaks was immediate and profound as fear mounted. People would abandon their families, their homes, and their moral codes. The healthy would flee, leaving the sick to die alone, or locking them into their homes to prevent contagion. Bodies, often emaciated by famine and then ravaged by plague, would lie unburied in streets, homes, and public spaces, further contaminating the environment. Lawlessness, desperation, and violence would prevail, turning once orderly communities into chaotic landscapes of suffering and death. This complete disintegration of social order, spurred by the double horror of famine and plague, revealed the terrifying fragility of medieval civilization, where survival became a ruthless, individualistic pursuit. One common misconception is that famine and plague were entirely separate events. In reality, famine often preceded and exacerbated plague outbreaks, acting as a crucial predisposing factor. A malnourished population, particularly one forced into overcrowded urban centers by rural famine, was far more susceptible to infection and had a significantly higher mortality rate when plague or other epidemic struck. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, by weakening millions across northern Europe, is seen by many historians as having potentially made the subsequent Black Death of 1347 Shinfao even more devastating and widespread. This terrifying synergy between hunger and disease was a defining horror of the medieval period, creating a perfect storm for mass death. Historians still meticulously study paleopathological evidence from mass plague graves, analyzing skeletal markers for malnutrition alongside bacterial DNA for Yersinia pestis and medieval demographic records, comparing famine mortality with plague mortality to understand the precise interaction and combined impact of these two catastrophic forces, confirming their devastating and often symbiotic relationship in medieval mortality crises. Furthermore, the psychological toll of experiencing both famine and plague simultaneously would be immense. You would live in perpetual terror, witnessing unimaginable suffering, constantly surrounded by death, the despair, the fear of contagion, and the knowledge that your body was already weakened by starvation would erode your spirit, leaving you in a state of profound hopelessness. The rapid, indiscriminate nature of plague, combined with the slow agony of famine, would make every day a waking nightmare, blurring the lines between life and agonizing death. You would be a ghost among the living, constantly surrounded by the dead. The superstitious beliefs surrounding plague, such as attributing it to divine punishment for sins, astrological alignments, or Miasma, bad air, only added to the terror and futility. Without a scientific understanding, communities resorted to desperate, often harmful, measures flagellation, self-whipping, believing it would atone for sins, scapegoating minority groups leading to tragic persecutions of Jews or lepers, or extreme religious rituals, all of which failed to stop the spread of the disease and often intensified social chaos. This helplessness in the face of an invisible, seemingly supernatural killer contributed to widespread panic and profound psychological distress, eroding faith and trust. The sheer scale of death would be incomprehensible. Villages decimated, cities emptied, populations reduced by a quarter, a third, or even more, across entire continents. The landscape of your world would be transformed into a vast cemetery, littered with bodies, a haunting testament to the combined efficiency of hunger and disease. Survivors would carry the indelible scars of this trauma for the rest of their lives, their memories haunted by the images of death and despair, forever changed by the sheer scale of the suffering they witnessed. The breakdown of traditional burial rites as discussed in The Awful and Dangerous Reality of Childbirth for a Medieval Woman. Chapter 4, the core issue of mass graves applied to larger populations during the plague, was particularly horrifying. Bodies, often emaciated by famine and then covered in plague buboes, would lie unburied in streets and homes, further contaminating the environment. The living, too few and too terrified, simply could not cope with the volume of the dead. This public display of death, stripping away all dignity, was a final, horrifying indignity in your struggle for survival, a testament to the utter collapse of societal norms. So, your desperate attempt to survive a medieval famine was inextricably linked to the plague's horrifying shadow. Widespread disease outbreaks, particularly the Black Death, exacerbated by your starved body and the unsanitary conditions, turned your existence into a relentless battle against unseen, merciless killers. This terrifying synergy between hunger and contagion, leading to rapid, agonizing death, was a defining, profoundly terrible aspect of surviving a famine in the Middle Ages, ensuring that your life was a continuous struggle against utter obliteration. Even as your emaciated body fought against the ravages of famine and plague, and your spirit withered under despair, the struggle for survival in a medieval famine would often force you and your family to confront the most agonizing and heartbreaking choices, selling what's left. Forget dignity or inherent rights. In the face of imminent death, you might be compelled to sell off your meager possessions, your children, or even yourself, for a single morsel of food, making this desperate act a profoundly terrible reality. Imagine the depth of your despair. Your home is empty of food, your family is gaunt with hunger, and the specter of death looms closer with each passing day. All other avenues of survival foraging for inedible plants, begging in the streets, migrating to already overwhelmed cities have proven insufficient or too perilous. The physical pain of starvation would be relentless, overwhelming all other thoughts. In this extreme desperation, you would be forced to consider choices that, in normal times, would be utterly unthinkable, tearing at the very fabric of your humanity. It truly sucked to be forced to sell your soul. The first tragic step, often a futile attempt to buy time, would be to sell off your remaining possessions. Your humble cottage or hanok if you're in Joseon, Korea, as in a previous episode, might contain a few cherished items, a worn tool for farming, a simple piece of jewelry passed down through generations, a spare blanket, or a religious artifact. These items, representing your family's history and meager wealth, would be reluctantly carried to the local market if it still functioned, or offered to a wealthier neighbor or a moneylender, they would be bartered away for a few handfuls of grain, a piece of stale bread, or a spoonful of rancid fat. Imagine walking to the market, your head bowed in shame, offering up a family heirloom, knowing it would fetch only a day's worth of food, a temporary, fleeting reprieve from inevitable starvation. This liquidation of your very identity for a fleeting chance at survival was a profound degradation. It really sucked to trade your memories for crumbs. But when possessions ran out, and your family's cries of hunger persisted, the choices became truly agonizing, pushing you to the absolute abyss of human desperation. The ultimate horrifying sacrifice for a starving family was often the sale of children. Young boys and girls, particularly those who were still strong enough to endure forced labor, might be sold into slavery or indentured servitude to wealthier landowners, merchants, or even monasteries in exchange for a sum of money or a guaranteed supply of food for the remaining family members. Imagine the unimaginable agony, a mother holding her child close for the last time, their tiny body trembling with hunger, as she makes the impossible decision to sell them into an unknown future, hoping it offers them a chance at life, however bleak, and secures a few more days of survival for her other children. The heartbreaking cries of the child, the silent screams of the parents, the profound sense of betrayal and loss would haunt them for the rest of their short lives. This was not a business transaction. It was a profound violation of love and family bonds, driven by the most desperate, primal need to prevent total family annihilation. It truly sucked to sell your own flesh and blood for bread, the children themselves, thrust into this new reality, would be condemned to a life of servitude, often brutal and relentless. They would be forced to work long hours, often in harsh conditions, forever separated from their families and their childhood. While for some, it might indeed offer a chance at survival, receiving regular, if meager, food. It meant a childhood stolen, a future enslaved, and a profound emotional trauma that would mark them forever. Their sale was a direct result of famine's brutal logic, turning human beings into commodities for survival, stripping them of all dignity and autonomy. Even more desperate, some individuals might resort to selling themselves into temporary servitude or debt bondage. As an adult, you might offer your labor for a fixed period, perhaps several years, in exchange for food and shelter, hoping to survive the famine and regain your freedom later. This was a form of self-enslavement, a desperate gamble on your future, often leading to endless cycles of debt and perpetual servitude, as the terms of your bondage might be extended for any perceived transgression or new debt incurred. Imagine walking to a wealthy landowner, offering your strong arms and your very freedom for a few meals, knowing you might never be truly free again, condemned to a life of labor without end. It truly sucked to sign your life away for a bowl of gruel. The reasons for such extreme acts were simple and terrifying: survival at any cost. In a world without social safety nets, where famine meant widespread and agonizing death, every option, however morally repugnant or personally devastating, would be considered. The choice was not between good and bad, but between agonizing death by starvation and the profound degradation of selling one's dignity, one's family, or one's freedom for a chance, however slim, to continue existing. This was the ultimate test of human desperation, pushing individuals beyond the boundaries of what was considered acceptable or even human. The lack of options and pervasive helplessness created this brutal market. There were no government assistance programs, no widespread charitable organizations beyond limited monastic aid. and no means of escaping the region's total collapse. You were utterly at the mercy of those who still possessed resources, and they often exploited your desperation without mercy, extracting the ultimate price for a temporary reprieve from starvation. One common misconception is that medieval families simply stick together no matter what, and that such sales were unheard of. While strong family and communal bonds certainly existed and were vital for survival in normal times, extreme famine pushed these bonds to their absolute breaking point, forcing individuals into agonizing choices that tore families apart. Records from medieval orphanages, poor relief organizations, and later legal documents sometimes hint at the widespread practice of selling children or self-enslavement during periods of severe economic crisis and famine. The very existence of laws regulating such sales, or monastic records of donated children, points to a grim reality that such desperate acts were not rare exceptions, but a horrifying coping mechanism. Historians still meticulously study medieval demographic records, poor relief accounts, and legal documents at G.G. de manumission records, debt contracts from periods of severe famine to understand the precise social and economic disintegration that occurred within families, often revealing heartbreaking patterns of human desperation and irreversible family loss. Furthermore, the act of selling a child or oneself was not without its own set of dangers and additional suffering. The buyers, often unscrupulous, might exploit your desperation, offering far less food or money than your family's true worth. The journey to deliver the child, or yourself, to your new master could be perilous, fraught with the same dangers of famine, disease, and exploitation that plagued all migrants. You were incredibly vulnerable, with no recourse for injustice once the deal was made, and no way to ensure the well-being of the family member you had sold. The psychological toll of making such choices would be immense and lifelong. For the parents who sold their children, the guilt, the heartbreak, and the gnawing uncertainty about their child's fate would be a perpetual torment, haunting their dreams and their waking moments. For the children sold into servitude, the trauma of abandonment and the brutality of their new lives would leave indelible scars on their psyche, shaping their entire future. For those who sold themselves, the profound loss of freedom, the constant indignity of bondage, and the fading memory of a life once lived autonomously would be a source of profound despair. These agonizing decisions, born of starvation, would haunt the survivors, leaving a lasting legacy of grief, shame, and irreversible loss. Your very continued existence was a testament to impossible choices, purchased at an unbearable personal and familial cost. The ultimate tragedy was that even these desperate acts often provided only temporary relief. A few days' worth of food or a small sum of money from selling a child would quickly be consumed, forcing the remaining family to face the same agonizing choices again, or eventually succumb to the famine anyway. The sale was a desperate gamble, often a futile attempt to delay the inevitable, but a gamble born of a desperation so profound that it overrode all other human instincts and moral considerations. The promise of survival was a cruel, fleeting illusion. So, your survival during a medieval famine meant confronting the agonizing, terrible reality of selling what's left your meager possessions, your beloved children, or even yourself for a single morsel of food. This heartbreaking act of desperation, stripping away dignity, tearing families apart, and condemning individuals to servitude or perpetual debt, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of how you would survive a famine in the Middle Ages. ensuring that every day of prolonged existence was bought at an unbearable personal and familial cost. Even as your body wasted away from slow starvation and your spirit withered under the indignity of desperate acts like selling your children, the relentless grip of famine could push human beings to confront the most terrifying and ultimate taboo, cannibalism. Forget all morality in the most extreme stages of hunger, when all other food sources vanished. Desperate individuals resorted to the unthinkable, making your survival profoundly terrible. Imagine the profound psychological transformation. Your stomach constantly gnawing, your mind dulled by relentless hunger, your body emaciated and weak. The line between human and animal would blur as survival became the sole imperative. You would witness, or perhaps contemplate, acts of desperation that defied all societal norms, all religious prohibitions. This wasn't about malice, it was about the primal, terrifying drive to simply continue existing when all other options had vanished, pushing human beings beyond the very limits of their humanity. The stench of desperation would fill the air, a physical manifestation of the moral decay. It truly sucked to see humanity stripped bare. The historical evidence for widespread cannibalism during famines in the Middle Ages and other periods is horrifying, though often recounted in later chronicles that might sensationalize or use it as a moral lesson. However, consistent accounts from severe famines across Europe, like the Great Famine of 1315-1317, speak of desperate acts where human flesh became a source of sustenance, eating the dead necrophagy. The most common and perhaps least morally repugnant to some, in their desperate calculus form of cannibalism, involved consuming the bodies of those who had already died from starvation or disease. Imagine scavenging through a mass graves or finding a freshly dead corpse in an alleyway, your hunger so overwhelming that your moral compass simply ceased to function. The thought of eating human flesh, the smell, the taste, it would be utterly revolting. Yet your desperate body would compel you forward, driven by a primal urge to survive for another agonizing day. This wasn't a choice. It was a horrifying compulsion, a desperate act of self-preservation that would forever haunt your psyche. The very act of consuming a human corpse, however dead, was a profound violation of social and religious taboos, leaving you spiritually tainted, eating the weak or vulnerable, survival cannibalism. In the most extreme and disturbing cases, hunger could lead to unthinkable acts against the living, particularly the weakest members of society, infants, young children, or the elderly who were already succumbing to starvation. Accounts, though often highly sensationalized and debated by historians for their literal truth, suggest instances where desperate individuals or groups might resort to killing and consuming those too weak to resist, or even, most horrifyingly, one's own children, to extend their own lives for a few more agonizing days. Imagine the unspeakable horror, the complete breakdown of familial bonds, the absolute abyss of desperation that would lead to such an act. This was the ultimate taboo, a descent into pure savagery, a profound violation of every human instinct and moral code, blurring the line between victim and perpetrator. It truly sucked to have your survival come at such an unspeakable cost. Self-cannibalism, autophagy. In rare, extreme instances, the truly desperate, left utterly alone, might even resort to consuming parts of their own body, gnawing at fingers or toes, driven mad by hunger and despair. This was a final, horrifying act of self-consumption, a clear sign that the individual had reached the absolute limits of human endurance and sanity, their very being consumed by the all-encompassing need to survive. The psychological toll of witnessing or contemplating such acts would be immense and permanent. The memory of consuming human flesh, the knowledge of the unspeakable actions taken for survival, would leave indelible scars on your psyche. You would live with profound guilt, self-loathing, and a pervasive sense of having crossed an irreversible moral boundary. Your humanity would feel irrevocably tainted, leading to deep despair, paranoia, fearing others might do the same to you, and a profound sense of isolation. Even if you survived the famine, you would forever be haunted by the horrifying choices forced upon you by hunger. Your past actions, a constant, tormenting shadow. It really sucked to literally lose your soul to starvation. The breakdown of social norms during such extreme famine was absolute. All laws, all morality, all religious prohibitions seemed to vanish in the face of overwhelming hunger. The social contract, the bonds that held communities together, disintegrated. Compassion, empathy, and charity would be replaced by brutal individualism, suspicion, and a ruthless, primal struggle for survival. Neighbors would become threats, and even family bonds could shatter under the ultimate pressure of starvation. The collective descent into such barbarity was as terrifying as the hunger itself, demonstrating how quickly civilization's veneer could crack. One common misconception is that cannibalism during famines was a widespread and deliberate strategy for survival. While it did occur in the most extreme and desperate circumstances, it was always a sign of total societal collapse and utterly desperate measures, not a planned or common practice. Historical accounts are often vague or sensationalized, but archaeological evidence, e.g., specific cut marks on human bones in mass graves or charnel pits has, in rare instances, confirmed the occurrence of peri-mortem around the time of death consumption. Though distinguishing between ritualistic and survival cannibalism can be challenging and is a subject of ongoing academic debate among historians and bioarchaeologists, the very fact that such accounts were shocking and condemned by contemporary chroniclers indicates that it was a profound taboo, not a normal part of medieval life, and was a sign of absolute, unimaginable desperation. Historians still meticulously study these rare and disturbing instances, using forensic anthropology and textual analysis to understand the precise context and motivations behind cannibalism during severe famines, confirming it as an act of ultimate desperation rather than a common practice, highlighting the utter breakdown of humanity. Furthermore, the lack of nutritional benefit from cannibalism often added to its futility. While providing calories, consuming human flesh, particularly from diseased or starved bodies, carried immense risks of transmitting further disease like kuru, a prion disease, though unknown at the time or providing insufficient nutrients to truly reverse the course of starvation. The brutal act often merely prolonged agony for a few more days or weeks, or brought new forms of illness. Without offering a true path to sustainable survival, your horrifying choice was often in vain, a desperate act with no lasting benefit. The fear of being a victim of cannibalism would also be a constant, chilling terror as hunger intensified. You would live with the horrifying knowledge that the living might turn on the dead, or even on the weakest of the living, for sustenance. This existential threat, coming not from an external enemy, but from your own desperate kind, added another profound layer of terror to your daily existence, transforming your fellow sufferers into potential predators. You were not just fighting hunger, you were fighting the complete unraveling of humanity. constantly vigilant for the monstrous acts that desperate starvation could compel. The aftermath of such acts, for those who survived the famine, would be a lifetime of profound trauma. The memories would haunt them relentlessly. The guilt would gnaw at their souls, and their understanding of human nature would be irrevocably shattered. They would live as witnesses to the ultimate taboo, forever marked by the horrors they had seen or committed, in a world that would rather forget such unspeakable desperation. This psychological scarring was a permanent wound, a silent testament to the extreme depths of human suffering during famine, shaping their worldview into one of grim, primal survival. So, your survival during a medieval famine, having exhausted all of their options, could lead you to confront the horrifying, ultimate taboo of cannibalism. This descent into the unthinkable, consuming the dead or even the living, was a desperate act of self-preservation born of absolute starvation, making your continued existence a profound violation of humanity. This terrifying, irreversible step, transforming desperate individuals into figures of unspeakable horror, was a defining, profoundly terrible aspect of how you would survive a famine in the Middle Ages. You've endured the horrifying whispers of hunger, suffered the agonizing, slow starvation of the hunger gap, debased yourself through desperate foraging of inedible plants and tree bark, endured the perilous journey of abandoning your ancestral land, faced the brutal reality of begging and petty crime in overcrowded cities, witnessed the devastating synergy of famine and plague, struggled with the ultimate unthinkable taboo of cannibalism, and perhaps even survived. As the phantom ache of starvation subsides and the echoes of desperation finally dissipate, a profound, lingering truth settles upon you. Surviving a terrible famine in the Middle Ages was not just a testament to human endurance, it was a horrifying, soul-scarring ordeal that left profound physical and psychological scars, reshaping both individuals and society forever. Physical ruin. A body betrayed by hunger. Consider the physical ruin that plagued your body. You were not merely thin. You were emaciated, your muscles wasted, your bones brittle, your body consumed by edema. Chronic malnutrition led to debilitating conditions like scurvy, anemia, and various vitamin deficiencies, causing bleeding gums, loose teeth, and an insidious physical decay. Your immune system, utterly compromised, left you vulnerable to rampant infectious diseases, dysentery, typhoid, plague that often claimed more lives than hunger itself. Your survival was a continuous act of physical suffering, a prolonged battle against a body that was slowly, agonizingly, breaking down from within. It truly sucked to have your body betray you so completely, its every function screaming in protest. Psychological and moral degradation. The cost to your soul. Then there's the unimaginable psychological and moral degradation. The relentless, primal urge for food warped your perception, turning once familiar landscapes into battlegrounds for survival. The desperation forced you into agonizing choices, abandoning your ancestral land, resorting to begging, engaging in petty crime, or even in the direst circumstances, witnessing or contemplating the ultimate taboo of cannibalism. These were acts that tore at the very fabric of your humanity, leaving indelible scars of guilt, shame, and a profound sense of having crossed an irreversible moral boundary. Your spirit was broken, your dignity stripped away, replaced by a pervasive numbness and a terrifying capacity for acts born of pure desperation. It truly sucked to lose your soul to hunger. Shattered society, bonds strained to breaking. And what about the shattered social fabric? Famine systematically eroded the bonds of family and community, mutual aid, while vital, was stretched to its breaking point by universal scarcity, leading to suspicion, resentment, and a brutal individualism where survival trumped compassion. Children were sold, families disintegrated, and the once close-knit village became a place where every neighbor was a potential rival in the desperate search for food. Cities, initially beacons of hope, became overcrowded death traps, rife with disease and chaos, offering little more than a collective descent into misery. The very structures of society fractured under the relentless pressure of widespread hunger, revealing how thin the veneer of civility truly was, a scarred legacy, survival, and trauma. Finally, the profound and lasting impact on those who survived. Your body might heal, but the scars of a chronic malnutrition would be permanent stunted growth, weakened bones, persistent ailments, the psychological trauma of living through such an apocalypse, witnessing widespread death. Performing desperate acts, enduring constant fear would haunt you for a lifetime. You would carry the guilt of survival, the memories of unspeakable horrors, and a fundamental shift in your worldview, forever knowing the fragility of life and the terrifying depths of human desperation. Your survival was a triumph of endurance, but also a profound, lifelong burden. It truly sucked to be haunted by your past every single day. The Great Famine, a historical testament. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 stands as a stark historical testament to these horrors, devastating much of northern Europe and causing millions of deaths. It was characterized not by sudden, dramatic events, but by a slow, agonizing process of attrition, exacerbated by relentless rains, crop failures, and cold summers. This period led to widespread abandonment of villages, mass migrations to cities which quickly became death traps, and a profound societal breakdown that lingered for decades, influencing the subsequent impact of the Black Death. This pivotal event in medieval history demonstrates the immense, pervasive, and systemic nature of famine's brutality, a true Malthusian catastrophe that reset the human condition for centuries. Historians still meticulously study paleoclimate data from tree rings, ice cores, agricultural yields recorded in manorial accounts, and demographic data from parish registers to reconstruct the precise causes and widespread impact of specific famines, consistently confirming their devastating human cost and their role as catalysts for broader societal change. The enduring scar, cultural memory, one particularly poignant and often overlooked detail is the cultural memory of famine that permeated medieval society for generations, even decades after a major famine. The collective trauma would be reflected in stories, folk songs, and religious sermons. Children would grow up hearing tales of their parents' desperate struggles, of famine foods, and the horrors of cannibalism. This oral tradition served as a constant, grim reminder of vulnerability, often shaping deeply conservative attitudes towards agriculture and resource management, influencing social behavior, and reinforcing reliance on communal bonds. However fragile, this pervasive cultural scar highlights how deeply famine etched itself into the very psyche of medieval communities, shaping their understanding of both resilience and existential threat. Ultimately, your experience surviving a terrible famine in the Middle Ages was not just a chapter in history, it was a brutal, all-consuming ordeal that tested the very limits of human endurance, body, mind, and soul. It was a harrowing descent into desperation, a profound lesson in the fragility of life, and a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both resilience and unimaginable cruelty when confronted by the most primal and relentless of enemies, absolute hunger. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the distant whispers of ancient hunger and the imagined cold of the medieval winter finally subside. You are safe, warm, and well-fed, incredibly far removed from the brutal realities of a famine-stricken past. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of abundant food, clean water, and the profound comfort of a world where basic sustenance is a right, not a terrifying life or death gamble. A stark contrast to the terrible truth we've explored tonight. And now, good night, and have sweet dreams.